I am Kate Varona. I use she, her pronouns. I am a program manager with SAWS, and I also sit on the Forest Service WCM Central Team. I am calling in today from Asheville, North Carolina, and that is also the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. I have some Linville Gorge wilderness behind me, thanks to Scotty Bowman, a beautiful picture out there. That's a nearby wilderness to me. And we are going to be talking about the wilderness character monitoring within the Forest Service. So I think that some of this content is applicable across agencies, but especially in the back end with measures and baselines, it's really going to be Forest Service specific. And we will go over a variety of topics in collecting information, data, narratives, measures, and baseline assessments. I know there's also a lot of knowledge in the room. So folks who've done WCM before, folks on the central team, so feel free to chime in as we're going along in our presentation. So I wanted to start here real quick for folks who are new. This can be kind of a confusing point. I'll focus in kind of right here. There are two different frameworks that we're going to be talking about a little bit. So there's Wilderness Character Monitoring, WCM. This is an interagency framework. This is a framework that's being implemented across the National Wilderness Preservation System. So all 4 agencies that manage for wilderness are implementing wilderness character monitoring. It's been in development for a number of years, and it was developed independently from Wilderness Stewardship Performance. So WCM, interagency, it's a holistic view on wilderness character, and it is a tool that managers can use to kind of monitor wilderness character trends over time. And then I'll just point out Wilderness Stewardship Performance, WSP, another acronym we use often. This is a Forest Service specific framework. It is interdisciplinary, so across a variety of programs in the Forest Service. It was developed independently from WCM, but it does incorporate WCM now and that language. So WSP is made up of a variety of elements, and wilderness character monitoring, or as we call it, wilderness character baseline, is the specific element name within WSP. And it uses, it kind of breaks out WCM in a variety of components that Mike and Jacob and I will talk about in a little bit. And it breaks it up into kind of these points. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of a distinction to kind of help us with our vocab and how we're talking and thinking about WCM. This WSP has those 20 elements that you saw there. Some of them are, rec site monitoring or invasive species. And so wilderness character baseline is one of those elements. And within those elements, they're broken up into kind of these point systems here. And that's how we're going to think about WCM in this context. So we're going to talk about 2 through 8. That's another thing you'll hear a lot of folks might say, oh, I'm working on the 4 point of WCM, or oh, I'm working on the 8 point. So this is kind of what they're talking about here. And so we'll go through it there. Just wanted to point it out for everyone. So we'll start with our 2 point. I'll walk through the legislative and administrative documents. It's kind of the first thing that folks do when they're starting to implement WCM. If they've done no previous work in it, this is kind of the starting point, the 2 point level. So this is collecting legislative and administrative documents. If you're working on a forest and you want to start implementing WCM, you want to gather all the information that you have. Legislative documentation is a really good starting point. Any kind of congressional hearings, any kind of designating language, we want to compile all that into a folder. Really good information to use in your narratives when you're talking about, why was a place designated, or what was being said about a place before it was actually designated. You can use House reports. I provided a few websites here of some congressional hearings. Wilderness.net has a lot of good documents that can be used on some of the legislative histories. I've found some good information in archived newspapers, and maybe if you have a few big towns nearby your wilderness, you might check there, and there could be information about what was it like during the time, what was being said. Maybe there were public hearings, and so you can gather some of that information from back when it was designated, or even if it was very recently designated. So kind of compiling all of that information into a place to be used throughout the process. Just kind of making a note here that if your wilderness was designated a while ago, some of that information might only exist as hard copies. And being mindful of that, maybe trying to find it in some forests have their own libraries. Visitor centers might have their own libraries, and trying to obtain some of the information that way. So also part of the 2-point is gathering that administrative documentation. So those are things like existing management plan, maybe there's a wilderness management plan, a fire management plan, or other things that might mention wilderness, any MOUs or memorandum of understandings between, something that might be happening in wilderness and another agency, any kind of scientific reports or NEPA documents, MRAs, minimum requirement analysis is what an MRA is. Those kinds of administrative documents might be in different program areas. They might be in different locations. It all depends, but gathering them all into one place so that you kind of can start with a foundation of documents and information before you dive into writing your narratives or your baseline assessments. Kind of as it points out here, they're probably not in a single place, but if they are, that would be great. Looking at different shared drives, different people's offices. These might also, some of the reports might also be only hard drive. And so just kind of getting access to that and putting it all in one place. Here's just a quick example of a file structure, which will be helpful when you're compiling this information, having one on legislative and administrative documents, as well as kind of breaking it into each of the 5 qualities, untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, and then also having kind of an all qualities. If it spans over 2 or more qualities, you might throw it in there. And that way, this can easily be referenced throughout your time implementing wilderness character monitoring. Great. So that's kind of the 2-point, pretty straightforward, gathering documents, data, and information. So now we'll move on to our 4-point. This is where that wilderness character narrative comes in, and we'll go through kind of what that is and what to put in it. So this is an example wilderness character narrative. These are descriptions of your narrative, kind of describing what is special, what is unique about your specific wilderness. So each wilderness will have one of these typically. This is kind of your opportunity to capture those intangible aspects of your wilderness. So we'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide, but your baselines, as Mike will go into a little more, are really capturing kind of your quantitative data. What can be measured, how many developments, how many trammeling actions. And so your narrative is this opportunity to capture things that we don't necessarily monitor with quantitative data, like self-discovery and exploration, or that spiritual component of wilderness character. So one story that had been told to me in the past was when Peter Landers and some of that interagency team were looking at were developing wilderness character monitoring. They did a test run, 2012, 13, and the monitoring part was going great, collecting all the data. They were able to kind of tweak measures and figure out what worked, what didn't. But one component that was really lacking, they found in one of those trial runs, is kind of more description about what makes the wilderness really special, or some of those spiritual components or experiential components of wilderness that people really value and connect with, but aren't really showing up in these monitoring, these measures, these quantitative data assessments. And so they were that was kind of where this idea of the narrative was born. Like, let's have a description and capture some of those intangible things about this wilderness, as well as monitoring some of the threats over time. So a narrative is kind of this opportunity to describe what makes the wilderness wildernessy, kind of why was it designated? How is this wilderness embodying wilderness character, and how are people connecting with it? So the wilderness character narratives are organized by the 5 qualities of wilderness character. For a reminder, those are the untrammeled, the natural, undeveloped, opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation, as well as other features of value. And let's see, I gotta move this guy a little bit here. So these are descriptions of what we're protecting today. All right, so this is kind of how it's structured. A narrative will typically start with an overview of the area. You want to tell people, set a geographic tone, kind of where are we talking about? Where is this wilderness located? What forest is it on? What state, what region is it in? And introducing us to the wilderness. There's some wiggle room in the overview here. There's a lot of capacity to talk maybe about what happened before the wilderness was designated, maybe like a little intro to the history of the area. And then we get into kind of those 5 qualities. The narrative will go into highlight each quality independently. So this one, as an example, is kind of the untrammeled quality up here. Here's just a few typicals, but there's variation in how a narrative can be set up. But typically you'd have 1 to 2 pages per quality, and you could do more. I've seen some wildernesses where the natural quality was so important, like maybe they had a lot of endemic species to talk about or a lot of rare species, and they really wanted more space to expand in the natural quality. Then sure, it can be multiple pages long. I've seen a few narratives where it's like, we don't have as much to talk about in the other features of value or the untrammeled quality. So, maybe it's only a page. And so that variation across wildernesses is completely fine. And so what we're focusing mostly is on what exemplifies how does the quality exemplify in your wilderness. So if you have, this is an example of Ellicott Rock Wilderness. I'm in the untrammeled quality. And so I'm talking about like how is Ellicott Rock Wilderness untrammeled? And so for example, in this one, we talked about, the wild and scenic Chattooga River, which was an undammed area, one of the largest undammed rivers in the East. And so we were able to kind of describe how that was not being trammeled on and really exemplify how this area is untrammeled. And so the bulk of your narrative is going to be about describing how, in a positive way, how your wilderness exemplifies each quality. Like, how is your wilderness undeveloped? How is your wilderness untrammeled? And then you're also going to want to highlight, what are some threats to those qualities? So after you've talked about and highlighted what makes your wilderness, like why it was designated, what are we preserving? You'll also want to identify, what does degrade this quality or what might degrade it in the future. So these are, kind of like bigger concepts. Maybe you have an area that is going to be implementing designated campsites, let's say, in your wilderness. And so that's going to degrade opportunities for primitive recreation if folks have to stay in a specific site, but maybe it hasn't been implemented yet. So that's like a good thing you could highlight on future threats. Like this is something kind of coming up. And so in your future, when you're describing these degradations or future threats, You want to give more generalization and overviews and not necessarily get into the weeds of this specific stats or the specific data, what specific regulation you might be talking about or what specific development you might be talking about. Yes, it's great to give those examples, but it isn't the place for your stats. That's where we'll want to use that content in the baseline assessments. And then you'll finish up your narratives with a conclusion, kind of wrapping up the document. Most people add kind of a references page or a contributions page. In order to get kind of the content that you want to put in these narratives, I always recommend talking to a variety of people and doing a variety of research. So, there's a lot of internet research you can do. You've gathered all your documents for the 2 all that legislative information, like pull out some of any good language you see about why your wilderness was designated or what folks were talking about or what it was like at the time. That's like a great place to incorporate that information within a narrative. And also talk to folks who've been around for a long time, whether that be your Forest Service, wilderness managers, your rec managers, but also everyone kind of who's been there for a while, fire managers, your botanists, your hydrologists, your visitor center front staff that have been there for a long time, your volunteers who've worked there for a really long time, your partners that have been working in the area. Being able to talk to a variety of people about like what makes this place really special, why are we working so hard to protect it, to preserve it, and kind of teasing out some of those really great content and reasons why people love the area and connect to the area. Those are some of the great things we can highlight in our narratives, which really don't get captured in our baseline assessments. Describe what exemplifies these qualities. All right, so I've mentioned a few of these, but in general, the narrative, the tone of the narrative, we want it to be affirmative. We want it to be positive, not necessarily a place where we're kind of ragging on all the things that are wrong with an area or all the things that could be better, but really highlighting what is good about it right now. The content should also be factual. You can pull information from people and why they like it, and that's all good information to include as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be stats when I'm saying factual. And make sure you're incorporating the intangible, the symbolic, those spiritual values, those things that aren't captured in the baseline. And making kind of a note here that a narrative is distinct from a baseline. So they are supplement documents. They are both talking about wilderness character monitoring, but I think sometimes there's a tendency, maybe for folks who've been working in their wilderness for a long time and have seen some degradations that are really a big bummer, or often are what we have to talk about when we're talking about managing an area. Or when someone dives in to collect the data about wilderness character, they might see like, oh, there's just so many people in this area, or man, there's just really a lot of, that road that comes into this wilderness is just such a bummer. But trying to kind of separate from that content that we're going to use in the baseline, those threats that we're monitoring, and kind of acknowledging that a narrative is distinct from a baseline. A narrative isn't necessarily a place to capture the very specifics of a baseline. It's not like a mini baseline. It's not a place where we have to spend a lot of time justifying why we had to put another development in the wilderness or why we had to trammel in this way, but really a space to highlight what we are protecting. It also definitely sets the stage for planning and monitoring in the future. So if you have in the narrative describing, this area that's untrammeled, or these streams that, don't have any impairment right now, kind of sets you up for the measure selections that Jacob will talk about in a little bit. And you can say like, hey, we do have some really pristine streams here. Like maybe we should definitely be monitoring it. Or, oh, we have some species here that are endemic to this area. We really want to make sure we are capturing other species, non-native invasive species that might be impacting our native species in the future. So it kind of sets you up for some wilderness character monitoring baseline assessment writing. All right, so here are a few kind of resources and examples I wanted to share about where some of these narratives are. So keeping it wild too, that we've mentioned a few times in my other session, this is kind of the framework that all the agencies agreed upon. It outlines the qualities, really great description of what each quality is of wilderness character. In the Appendix 3, there's a couple pages on, how to write a good narrative, what should go into the narrative for folks when you need a reminder. Keeping it wild in National Park Service. So I know this is a very Forest Service specific presentation, but keeping it wild in the Park Service was also, that was written by folks on the interagency team. It has a lot of the WCM language, and they have an entire chapter dedicated to writing a narrative. And that doesn't necessarily change a whole lot across agencies. So it's a really good reference, even if you're working in a different agency. And then in their appendix, kind of 2.2 through 2.5, they have some really great examples of how you might go about writing a wilderness character narrative, how to incorporate a variety of staff input in the writing process. And it also has I think 2 different narratives that were written early on that are really great about exemplifying and the positive things about a wilderness. And then another resource for folks writing working on wilderness character monitoring with the Forest Service, we have the Forest Service WCM external opinion folder. And in there we have kind of an examples document where there's a lot of kind of teased out some really great narratives, and also all the narratives that have been written in the Forest Service. So you can get a feel for how some of those are written. In this opinion folder, there's also a template. So if you want to use the pre-existing template, it's something that is provided and kind of sets you up to start writing one right away. Or if you would rather a different template, other folks have chosen to write narratives in a different way, and also they've turned out great. There's also the Forest Service WCM Central team to help answer questions or help review. We review and edit documents as you're going along. And then also there's some really good narrative examples on wilderness.net. Okay, so that was the narratives. Now I'll talk a little bit about the Wilderness Character Monitoring Technical Guide. I have my copy right here. So this guy was just published, yay, back in October. I have the draft version here that sits by my desk, something I use all the time. This is kind of like the Forest Service implementation document. It is something that I reference all the time when talking about or implementing or thinking about wilderness character monitoring. It really focuses on that 6, 8, and 10 point level, probably mostly your 6 and 8 point level, but it has some good information about some of our future work that we'll pursue in the 10 point level there. So we'll jump into it. Yay, this is it, published in October. All right, so I'm just gonna go hopefully pretty briefly into the structure of the tech guide. It's like a 300+ page document. So it's worth getting, a little bit of tips on how to navigate and best utilize this amazing resource that the Forest Service put together. So there's a few different parts here. There's a whole part 1. I'll get into it a little bit more detail, a part 2, and an appendices section here. So your part 1 is kind of your what and your why. It's describing those, basically the Forest Service's approach to WCM. So it does have a lot of that same language taken out of Keeping It Wild 2, which you'll definitely want to read if you're doing any wilderness character monitoring work. So it uses the same language, which is nice, transfers really well, and then dives a little bit deeper into how the Forest Service is implementing wilderness character monitoring. So there's a few pages in there that talk about the difference between WSP and WCM, great reminders if you get it confused in the future. It kind of dives into some of the Forest Service requirements, what are the Forest Service measures, what is required for each measure. It also highlights some of the wilderness and non-wilderness law that kind of impact impact wilderness character to some degree. It also highlights specific Forest Service policy that either addresses and says, the forest is going to be preserving wilderness character, as well as some other Forest Service policy that definitely play a role in implementing wilderness character monitoring. It also has some great, data sources, like where can you get some of the data that you might be after? Where does some of the national data come from that the Forest Service is choosing to use? What is legacy data? What's the difference between data that is baseline data and legacy data? So there's a few different pages on that, which becomes really relevant. I think Mike will talk about it a little bit soon. As well as some of that trend assessment. What are we going to be using this data for? What is it going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And how is that going to wrap up to inform us at the wilderness level, the forest level, and the national level? So it kind of explains all that. Part 1 is a really, really great read to spend some time on before you really dive into finding the data and implementing it on the ground. It does define each of the qualities. In keeping it wild too, I think goes into a little bit more detail, but there is some of that same content from Keeping It Wild too in the tech guide. And it also briefly describes some of these agency specific measures that Jacob will go into. It also, here's one page from the tech guide, just kind of has the big hierarchical structure of wilderness character, which I think is a great reminder. The tech guide goes into each of the 5 qualities, what those monitoring questions are, what each indicator of those monitoring questions are, and Forest Service specific measures. All right, that was part 1. So part 2, this is probably the section you'll reference the most once you really jump into wilderness character monitoring. It gives you kind of that step-by-step guidance along the way. So I have a few slides here as an example for what part 2 entails. So here we have a measure, the index of National Forest System developed trails. This is kind of like an example of what one of those sections would look like in the tech guide. So you have your quick summary of the measure. Some of them are longer than others, kind of how we're collecting, this data, where it's stored, and how that data might be calculated. This is your little summary sheet just for each individual measure, kind of letting you know, like, what kind of measure type is this? Is this required or something I can select from a list of measures? It also will have your protocol options here. It'll list, some measures have no protocol options, some have 4. So it kind of gives you that summary right there. It gives you your local tasks as well. So, is this something the central data analyst is going to be able to calculate for me, or is this something I need local staff to calculate for me? Where, what do I do with it? Where does it go after I have the data? And then it also has, your frequency. Kind of, this is the summary of each of the measures, and then there's a little bit more detail in the protocol here. So this is probably the section that might be referenced the most when you're thinking and talking about individual measures. This gives you, kind of each individual steps about where to get the data, where to look for the data, what data you're after, how to calculate the data, how to analyze it, how to make that calculation. There's also, each measure, usually each protocol ends with kind of a step 2 or 3 about how to enter this data into the National Wilderness Character Monitoring Database. And so a lot of great information here, not necessarily worth reading ahead of time, but when you're in the nitty-gritty of implementing a measure, trying to collect data for it, really reading through and getting a lot of your questions answered here, the step-by-steps. There's also a note under each measure here, your cautions and concerns about the protocol itself and how it might change in the future. You have your data adequacy here. This is kind of data adequacy for each measure at a national level, but not necessarily at a local level. So this could be very different depending on where you are. Your frequency, like how often this data is going to be compiled, analyzed, and entered into the database. And then how those trends are derived, a really good one for understanding how the information you're reporting here is going to be used in the future and rolled up in those trend assessments. And then, as if the tech guide needed some more content, there are also some really good appendices A couple of these kind of summarizing key attributes and also describing measures that weren't used. This can be really great when you're considering a locally developed measure. I'd always suggest checking here first to make sure it's not something that the Forest Service team had already thought about and specifically chose not to include in their Forest Service specific measures. All right, and I'm going to hand it off to Jacob Wall. He is the director for the Society for Wilderness Stewardship, and he's going to talk about your measures.
As Kate said, I'm Jacob Wall. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the program director with the Society for Wilderness Stewardship. I'm calling in from Tabernash, Colorado, a small town kind of close to Winter Park, if you know where that is, the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne people. And I'm here to talk to you about the 6-point step in the WSP Wilderness Character Monitoring element. So this is the one we're looking at. This step includes identifying what measures to use for monitoring and completing an evaluation of the data sources. And I'm also going to talk about the measures themselves and how we go about selecting these measures for individual wilderness areas. So what are measures? There are specific elements under each indicator for which data are compiled to assess a trend in an indicator. For example, a measure is miles of unauthorized trails, which is under the indicator remoteness from sights and sounds of human activity inside wilderness. In general, measures are human-caused threats to the indicator. And when these threats decrease, wilderness character is improved. When the threats increase, wilderness character is degraded. So, as I mentioned, these measures are the individual factors that we use to quantify the various qualities of wilderness character. So the Forest Service has 28 agency standard measures, and you can see all of those listed here. You might not be able to read them, but we'll go through each of them quickly. All of the measures were developed to be relevant and cost-effective across the agency, either because national data is already available for certain measures, or because local units are already collecting that information. And there are 5 types of measures. We'll go into what those are in a little bit. And measures are divided by wilderness character or wilderness quality. As you can see, they're broken up into the 5 qualities. And there are at least 2 measures per quality. And through this measure selection process, a wilderness must select at least 15 measures, but usually wildernesses do tend to select a few more than that. So now I'm going to quickly go through all of the measures, not too in depth, but if you are interested in learning more about them, we do have the tech guide that Kate talked about, and you could really get into the weeds. So here are the 2 untrammeled measures. The first measure monitors the number of authorized trammeling actions, and the second measure monitors the number of unauthorized trammeling actions. Authorized trammeling actions include things like fire suppression activities and spraying for weeds. Unauthorized trammeling actions can include things like illegal livestock grazing or unauthorized removal of vegetation or animals. So this is the natural quality measures, or these are the natural quality measures. There are 11 of them. The first, acres of non-indigenous plant species, which is pretty straightforward. The second is index of non-indigenous terrestrial animal species. And then there's also aquatic animal species included in that indicator. There are 5 air measures, including measurements of ozone, nitrogen, sulfur, haze, and a measure that uses an index of lichen species to analyze trends in air pollution. The last measure under the air and water indicator looks at the extent of water bodies with impaired water quality. And then there are 2 measures under the ecological processes indicator, including watershed condition class and livestock grazing. So yeah, sorry, I'm flying through these, but I thought it'd be important just to look at them briefly. So the undeveloped quality, there's 5 measures. The first monitors non-recreational physical developments, things like buildings and roads. And the second looks at the acres of inholdings. So then there are 3 measures that monitor the use of motor and mechanized vehicles and equipment, including authorized uses, use for emergency incidences, and then special provision authorizations. So now we're here at our 8 solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation measures, or SPUR, as we sometimes refer to them. The first indicator looks at remoteness from human activity inside of the wilderness and includes measures that monitor opportunities for solitude. And these include index of encounters, index of rec sites, acres of wilderness away from human activity, and miles of unauthorized trails. The next measure monitors acres of wilderness away from human activity, that is outside of wilderness. And then the following 3 measures monitor opportunities for unconfined recreation. And these include trails, constructed rec features, and visitor management restrictions. So, yeah, now we're at our last 2 measures under the other features of value quality. And one measure looks at monitoring integral cultural features, and the second looks at monitoring other features of value. And we'll talk a little bit more about these later in this presentation. So as you probably noticed, each of these measures that I just went through has a measure type that you saw on the right side of the screen. There are 5 different types of measures. The first is required. As it says, required measures must be tracked for each wilderness. Some of them allow you to choose which protocol to use to track them, but some of them do not. There are at least 2 required measures for each wilderness quality, except for the other features of value quality. And then for required measures, you cannot modify them. And some of them have protocol options, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then the second type of measures required to select at least one. We refer to them as RTSALO measures. In general, these are measures where you'll have several measures that track different aspects of the same indicator, and you'll be required to select at least one of the measured. So measures are selected based on their relevance to a wilderness. You can choose more than one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So third, required if relevant. The 2 measures under the other features of value quality fall under this category. You select them if they're relevant, you don't if they aren't. And then optional, these are similar to required if relevant. These measures are only relevant to some wilderness areas. They're both under the undeveloped quality, and you may choose them if you have data related to those measures. And then lastly, locally developed. So if in addition to those 28 agency standard measures, your unit may decide to create your own measure to monitor something that you consider integral to the wilderness character. And maybe it's not within that 28 measure list. And we'll talk a little bit more about when those are appropriate and how to choose those. So these are the 10 required measures. As you can see, there are at least 2 per quality, except for the other features of value. And these should start to look somewhat familiar to you. And as I mentioned on the last slide, some of these have protocol options. So acres of non-indigenous plant species, extent of water bodies with impaired water quality, and index of encounters. These 3 measures have protocol options. And I'm just going to run through one of these protocol options just so you can see what that means. So this is a look at the extent of water bodies with impaired water quality measure. There are 2 different protocol options, and you must select one of the options, whichever is more applicable to the wilderness. So for this example, you can choose miles of streams with impaired water quality or number of lakes that are impaired. So protocol option 1 or 2. It's not like RTSALO measures, so you can't select both. However, if you would like to choose both, you could always make the second protocol option into a locally developed measure. So let's talk a little bit more about the RTSALO measures. There are 14, and you must select at least one of these from each set. I'm just going to briefly go through each one of these sets. So the first set is in the animals indicator. And how do we go about choosing between monitoring terrestrial or aquatic animal species? So think about which are the bigger management problem. Non-indigenous animals include animals, obviously, such as feral livestock, swine, horses, burros, etc. But it also includes insects such as emerald ash borer and gypsy moth, and even pathogens such as white nose syndrome. If the wilderness area has livestock grazing, that would be included in the non-indigenous terrestrial animal species, and you would likely choose that protocol option. And then aquatic animals include things like fish, crustaceans, insects, pathogens, mussels come up a lot, as well as trout that are stocked, maybe non-indigenous trout that are stocked in high alpine lakes or things like that. And the thing is, if both are an issue, you can select both. So yeah, you don't have to make a decision if both are applicable. So this is the second set of RTSALO measures in the natural quality. So you must select at least one of the air measures from this set. And here's a little bit more information about how to go about choosing which measure is applicable for that wilderness area. First off, you'll want to be looking at the air quality plan, if there is one, talking with local or regional air resource specialists. And then also this table, which is pulled from the tech guide, it's super helpful when you're figuring out which air quality measures to choose. So for example, if you are in Alaska, you have it easy. You're going to be choosing the lichen measure, but if you're anywhere else, you'll have to make a choice, or you can always select more than one. And for this one, we see a lot of folks selecting 2 to 3 to even 4 measures. So within this RTSALO set, there are 2 that have protocol options, deposition of nitrogen and deposition of sulfur. And you must select either total deposition, which is protocol option 1, or wet deposition, which is protocol option 2. And that's for nitrogen. For sulfur, it's switched, but yeah, just look at the tech guide and go through that process. But this is usually dependent on the region or state data that's available. And when you're talking with your regional or local air quality folks, they'll help you out with the protocol option. Yeah, so the second, this is the ecological processes indicator. And here you have to choose either between number of AUMs of commercial livestock or watershed condition class. Basically, if grazing occurs in the wilderness, you will most likely select the number of animal unit months measure. If no grazing occurs, then you will select watershed condition class. But if grazing does occur, then you can also select both. So now we're in the spur quality. This is the first RTSALO measure set. So for this one, you have index of wreck sites. That's the most common measure to have data for, and the one we see folks picking or selecting the most. Miles of unauthorized trails is rarely selected just due to a lack of data, because it is pretty hard to collect information on. And if you do not have data for rec sites or unauthorized trails, then you'll be selecting the acres away measure. And that's something that Jim will help you pull data for, and any wilderness will have data for that measure. It's the least preferable, mostly because it's unlikely to change over time. But like all the other ones, you can select more than one. So for this RTSALO set, you can either choose number of recreation features or index of National Forest System trails. If you have data on the number of authorized rec features, these include things like bridges, toilets, airstrips, etc. Then you would want to select that measure. If there are trails in the wilderness, then you would want to also select that one. So a lot of times folks select both of these measures. So if you end up selecting multiple measures in a RTSALO set, you must remember to designate one as the primary measure. Basically, whichever one is the most important measure, and that primary cannot be modified, whereas the non-primary measure can be modified slightly. An example of this, as you can see here, is tracking only outfitter and guide unauthorized trails instead of unauthorized trails, just all of them. So required if relevant. So these are the other features of value measures. And when you're determining whether or not you should select either of these measures, the first step is to determine if there is, whether there are other features of value integral to the wilderness character. And if you answer yes to that first question, then you must determine whether it is feasible to monitor that integral value or values. And a lot of folks completing wilderness character monitoring answer yes to the first question, but no to the second, and end up not selecting either of these measures, mostly due to lack of data. But the cultural features measure monitors things like historical and cultural archaeological sites, while the other features looks at things like, say, a unique geologic site. So yeah, this slide helps with figuring out if you should be selecting the other feature of value measure. And these are some questions you can ask to determine this. First, is this feature specifically identified in the enabling legislation? That happens sometimes. If not, you can still select this measure, but it's more likely that you'll be selecting it if it is in the enabling legislation. Secondly, does the feature define how people think about the wilderness or how they value the wilderness? Is it the name of the wilderness, for example? So an example of this is saguaro wilderness in Arizona. The saguaro cactus is an integral feature of that wilderness area. And whoever was completing that wilderness character monitoring would likely want to select that measure. The next question is the feature nationally recognized or considered a priority heritage asset? And then finally, was the feature selected as an element for WSP? And then look in the tech guide, there's a lot more information on this. So now we're at the two optional measures. Both are under the undeveloped quality. If these are relevant and there's data, then please go ahead and select them. I won't get into them too much more. All right. So locally developed measures, they may be included if it monitors something integral to wilderness character and it is vulnerable to degradation, and the local unit can reliably monitor it with sufficient data adequacy. Also, if multiple protocol options are relevant for a measure, I talked about this earlier, like miles of impaired streams and number of lakes, then the second protocol option can always be added as a locally developed measure. And there's a process to adding these measures. Talk to the central team about it if you end up going through this process, and they'll help you. So now you know what all 28 measures are and what measure types they are, but you're probably thinking, how are the measure values collected or calculated? Where does the data come from? How frequently does the data get calculated, etc. So we don't have time to go through that for every measure, but I just wanted to give you a quick example. And this measure is index of recreation sites within primary use areas. In this table, Kate talked about it when she was going through the tech guide information, but it's at the beginning of each measure in part 2 of the tech guide. And it's really helpful for quickly understanding what is needed for the measure. So let's just go through this quickly. As you can see, this is a RTSALO measure. So you would either select this as your primary or secondary measure. There are no protocol options. The local tasks include understanding what types of recreation sites are counted for this measure, then compiling the data for each of those steps or sites, sorry. And then step 2 includes calculating the index value, which is this measure's value, and then entering that data into the WCMD. And I believe you'll be talking more about the databases tomorrow. And as you can see, there are no national tasks, so the central team does not help you pull this data. And the measure has a frequency of 5 years, so you'll be revisiting it every 5 years and doing a trend analysis then. In this measure, the index value is the number of rec sites in the wilderness area and their condition based on the National Minimum Protocol for Rec Site Monitoring. And I believe there's another one of these sessions on rec site monitoring. So you could tune into that if you'd like to know more about what that process looks like. And then you'll be using local data that is compiled and stored locally, and the measure value will also be calculated locally. Whereas some other measure values are calculated differently, and we could talk about that more as well. So this is how the index value is calculated and what is reported as the measure value. As you can see, there's 85 sites with a condition rating of 1. And Mike will talk more about the baseline assessment report later and what exactly goes into it. So let's review quickly. How do you complete the 6th point? You select at least one measure per indicator. You evaluate data sources to assess data quality and quantity. And then you decide whether or not to include the other features of value. And there are a number of resources available to help you identify which measures are important. The narrative, that's a great resource. So either you will be writing the narrative, which would be excellent, and you'll be pulling out what measures are important, or you could read it, and that will help you understand that as well. WSP elements, that's really helpful. That's a whole element selection process. So look at what WSP elements are selected for the wilderness. Also make sure to talk to local staff, interview staff. A lot of folks end up convening a team to brainstorm potential measures, but really there's a lot of options to go about this process. There isn't one standard way to do it. So really listen to folks at the local level, and most importantly, be flexible. So I'm just going to quickly run through what the measure selection form looks like, and the pieces needed to fill it out. So this is available on Pinion. If you're still having a hard time getting on Pinion, email Julie King. But so as you can see, it's basically a bunch of check boxes. You're going to go and check which measures you'd like to select. Then you write a short narrative for the non-required measures. As you can see, the required measures say no narrative needed. The second step is to select protocol options. So you'll indicate which protocol options you've selected, and it says it there. So you just have to put that information into the rationale section. And then if you're selecting more than one RTSALO measure, make sure to choose the primary one and write primary in that text box. And then lastly, there are spaces for locally developed measures. And if, say, you are making a local modification to a standard measure, if it's, say, the secondary measure, then also make sure to note that in this form. This is the last page of the measure selection form. In the first text box, just write a brief description of the process used to select measures, including all the folks who were involved. And then you're going to send this to the central team for a primary review. This is really important before you send it to the forest supervisor or district ranger for approval. And for this form, two people must sign it. The first being the line officer, so either a forest super or a district ranger, and the second being the regional program manager, the wilderness regional program manager. And they must review it and sign it as well. So that's the very last piece to this process. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mike Smith, who will talk more about the 8-point.
All right, thank you, Jacob. Yeah, I'm Mike Smith, WCM team leader. Been here since the beginning, 2018. So is Jacob, actually. Yeah, I'll be talking, kind of wrapping it up here, what everything's been leading to. Yes, I'm here working remotely from Austin, Texas, where it now rains every day, which is new. Anyway, can everyone see the screen? Good. All right. So yeah, Kate, Jacob kind of talked about all the 2 through 6 here, and I will be talking more specifically about the 8-point. And again, kind of like Jacob and Kate said, when we refer to 8-point, we're really only talking about, in this case, we're talking about the baseline assessment report. But I just wanted to say real quickly here, we don't actually consider the wilderness character baseline completed until the report's been reviewed and signed and all the data has been entered into the WCM database. So, but the report is the largest part, and yeah, it takes in all the information from everything you've done so far. If you're doing 2 through 6, you're kind of going up from each part, and it will all inform the report. And yeah, so kind of like the opposite of how Kate was describing the narrative, this will be very much quantitative. Pretty much all of it is quantitative. And how to actually write out the report, well, they're not asking you to just open up Microsoft Word and start typing. A lot of it's already done here. Not all of it, obviously, but yeah, you can see here, I'll talk about it in the next few slides, but you can see those yellow highlighted areas. That's where you're going to write in kind of your own information. So this template here has been developed for kind of every wilderness in the whole National Wilderness Preservation System. So you're going to have to or kind of customize it for what you have going on yourself. But yeah, just a slide just kind of saying overview of everything. Good segue from Jacob saying we want to have the central team review the measure selection form. Same thing for the baseline assessment report. We know a lot of district rangers, lead district ranger and forest supervisor who are going to want to review it, and they're probably not going to have as much time as maybe as a lot of other people in the office. So, and definitely not as much. Well, yeah, so you want to have the central team look at it first, so that when the line officers look at it, it's hopefully in its best version.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're coming in clear, except for when you lean back a little, you're away from your speakers.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, you're fading in and out just a little. Thanks.
All right. I'll try to talk loudly too. I don't know. I don't usually we go on this webcam, but my laptop wasn't looking great. So anyway, hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, talked about everything there. Goal, have the forest supervisor, lead district ranger to sign it if the forest supervisor maybe isn't is available. But yeah, I kind of hinted at how the yellow highlighted text, you'll see that all throughout the template. And that's where you're going to put in your own civic information. So we just saw there in the previous slide here, you're going to want to put what your actual wilderness name is. You don't want to leave it as XXX because it's not a wilderness. And then the red brackets, we'll see an example of all of this, but they're going to show recommendations, sort of, what you could use or could write and throughout the template. Since users can delete, kind of have to, because it will look really strange. All these recommendations are in the report. So delete those red text after you've used them and you've noted, the help to write out every part. And then blue text, yeah, this is if it's relevant, just delete if it's not. Just other parts kind of help you navigate through the template. And this is a huge theme through the whole template, is it's meant to be flexible. So again, delete what you don't need. It's made for every wilderness, so it's going to have every measure, and likely you're not going to be selecting every measure. If you listened well to what Jacob was talking about, you're going to be pretty well informed on which measures you're going to want to select. And then, yeah, you can go above and beyond. I'll talk a little bit about the ways you can do that. Above and beyond usually will involve an appendix or something of that nature, perhaps a locally developed measure, that really just whatever you need to most adequately describe the baseline condition of the wilderness. And so here, just kind of showing, this is all already typed in. You can see a few of those yellow, red X yellow areas where you would write in your wilderness name. But yeah, this is all just to, say that a lot of it's already written in. The introduction is kind of already written out for everyone. So not much to say there. We've kind of gone back and forth on the central team of whether the wilderness character narrative should be required in the baseline assessment report or keep it separate. They both have their own benefits. You can have it all in one place if you include it, or you can have it separate, and maybe it gets a little more attention from other staff in the office. But just ask around in your office, whoever your point of contact is, what they prefer, if they want to keep it separate or include it in the baseline assessment report. So yeah, back to the template. Like I said before, delete out what you won't need. You can see examples here of both the yellow, red highlight or yellow highlighted red text. We're going to select in what's specific to you, and then there's that red text that kind of helps you, like I said, navigate through the template, how to personalize it for your own wilderness. Yeah, so it'll have every measure. Originally, you'll delete out the ones you don't need because you didn't select them. And then here, the next part, this is mainly kind of if you just maybe a staff member just wants to look at the data. For in this example, UNTRAMMELED, they just want to know the authorized trammeling actions that have occurred the last few years. They don't really care so much about all of the detail. They just want to find it real quickly. Right before you go into all the specific detail, you can write out the year, data adequacy, and the measure baseline value. And I'll talk probably the next slide about, yeah, here we go. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this slide because this is going to be what each measure looks like. So yeah, in this example, acres of holdings was a good one to use because it's probably the easiest to grasp. You know, they're either there or they're not. Yeah, I'll just go through each line here. So the first line here, we see measure type. So you'll just write in, is it required? Is it required to select at least one? Is it optional? Required if relevant? Jacob already described all those conditions, so that's what you put there. This is where things get a little more interesting. Well, measure baseline value for acres of holdings. Let's say you didn't have any at all ever since the wilderness was designated as wilderness from congressionally designated. You would put 0 there, so that's pretty easy. We do have rolling averages and things like that, which we don't really get into here, but it won't always be a simple presence or absence. Anyway, you'll put in your measure baseline value for that. The year of data collection. So this is where I want to make a little distinction. There's the WCM year, Wilderness Character Monitoring year, and that's the year when all of your measures that you've selected have available data. And more practically, when you have the resources and funding to actually do the BA report, to do the baseline assessment report. So let's say that was 2020. Now, that doesn't mean that every measure is going to start from 2020. You can also use, Kate hinted at it earlier, legacy data. So acres of holdings we'll use again. Let's say your wilderness was designated in 1980, and you know from your data sources we'll talk about later that there have never been any inholdings. You would write in 1980 as your baseline measure year. So that's the baseline year of collection for that measure, not the WCM year, which is 2020. So a little confusing. I'll be saying this a lot, but always feel free to reach out to the central team to go through these kind of confusing parts. But yeah, that's one where the years are going to be a little different. But just think of the measure in itself. So if you're only thinking about acres of holdings, you didn't have any since 1980, you would write in 1980 there, or 2000, or whatever year you feel the most comfortable about using the data. And that's another part. Legacy data can have large gaps, or maybe just isn't as adequate as more recent data. So that's another judgment call. Talk with us about it when you think you should start that first measure baseline year. Interest of time, I won't much time on that, but that is one of the more confusing parts. So yeah, we'll keep going down. Measure description already written in. Don't have to do anything there. That's the example of what it'll say for acres of holdings. Background and context. So here's where there's going to be a little more writing involved. As you can tell, there's that giant red text. And again, after you've written this, delete all that red text out. But it'll help inform you what to write in there. And it's going to be, it's kind of like what it sounds like, a description and context of the relevance of the measure to the wilderness, how it relates to the wilderness character. Why you want to write why the measure was selected, the current state of the measure. So that's going to be, if you can use data there, current data, and then talk about, if you can, known previous conditions, and that's where the legacy data would come in, and then potential future changes. So kind of similar to the narrative in a much shorter context, but here I really want to focus on the more quantitative data, more quantitative side to it.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Just a quick time check, and we want to have a few minutes, right? For.
Yeah. All right, I'll go through as fast as I can. This slide is the one that's going to take the long. Once we get through here, we can go through pretty fast. But yeah, so sources, pretty straightforward there. If you have an air quality one, might use Jim Edmonds because he's a central data analyst and will provide a lot of air quality data. So that's an example there. Data accuracy, just talk about what how strongly you feel about the robustness and adequacy of the data. If it's really high or low, or it's right kind of in the middle. And then threshold for change, that's always going to be written right there. You don't have to do anything there. It's already written in. And then we originally said optional here, but afterwards we thought, no, this really needs to be put in there. You want to talk about the measures not used for monitoring, and you'll talk more in the conclusions, but you can talk kind of briefly why those measures weren't used. Can have all sorts of reasons. We'll get into the conclusions. Speaking of which, here we go. I'm glad there weren't 4 more slides in between because we're kind of running out of time. But anyway, conclusions, another big part. We are right in kind of everything you want to say about the wilderness that doesn't really fit in the just quantitative measure pages. So completeness of measures, describe the data here. You want to describe, what you think might happen in the future, and what are the factors that might affect that trend in the future. Now this is really important. This is probably might make up the bulk. How managers, so you want to write in what these threats are and maybe some possible solutions. And then this is another part to write a lot more about data adequacy. So really important, you want to really kind of raise a flag too if there's an issue. Let's say, talk about a lot of Region 8 wilderness have, the HWA, maybe HWA, or maybe out west you have the chytrid fungus, and there hasn't been any surveys done or something like that. You have to use professional judgment. You want to talk about that here and say, hey, we really think there might be a problem with these insects or fungus, and we really need to do some more surveying here. It's a really good spot to do it, and then just talk about other whatever you want to kind of write about the wilderness character there. And then kind of lastly here, we have the appendices, and this is kind of the spot just to write in or include maybe a huge graph here, like this goes on for 20 pages, and you don't really want to have that right in the middle of your report. Again, you're gonna have line officers be reading through this, and you want to save this for the end of the report. That'll be, if you really want to include a lot more detail, you have a lot of really good legacy data, you want to include it. The appendix is a good part, and then again, any other information you think might provide additional context, you can always write in. Use these appendices for just a little additional information. Real quickly, reminders here. A lot of it's already built in, not all of it. I'm certainly going to be doing a lot of writing and putting in the data. Conclusions and background and context is where most of the writing will come into play. And then again, templates meant to be flexible, so just customize it. Just make it so that it really speaks to your wilderness and it doesn't look like the just generic template that you started out with. And that's it. We have, I guess, 3 minutes for questions. I tried to go as fast as I could, but I'll open it back up to anyone with any questions.
Thank you, Mike. So Jacob had to hop off, but he said we could maybe run a few minutes late, depending on questions. So maybe figure about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our chat watchers, Drew and Jim, to maybe raise up some questions they've seen in the chat or ones that we think would be relevant to everyone. And then if you want to, do you want to stop sharing, Mike, and we'll big view here. I mean, you could also raise your hand. I'll try to see if I could see some raised hands, but why don't we just start off with Drew and Jim?
Drew, you want to do it? You did such a great job yesterday. I only see one really good question in here, so.
Yeah, I know, Jim, if you actually want to take that, I just found a link for the joint BLM US Forest Service baseline assessment template. So I'm working on getting that into the chat right now. I just added it to the WCM opinion site. So I'm just trying to get that added into the chat so people could follow up with that. I just saw that question asked in the chat.
Okay, no problem. So I think, so one of the first questions that we got was from Patrick Cross, and it was about the wilderness character narrative and how often it should be revised.
Yeah, I can talk about that, or Kate, if you want to jump in. Wow, we haven't really thought about that before, but certainly that would really help. If that's one part where that could help in the BA report, baseline assessment report. You'd already have it in there, and when you're going through, we didn't talk too much about the 10-point, but that's where you would assess the trends in the wilderness. And we're really going to focus more, we're talking about revising, we're really going to focus a lot on the data. So you could revise the narrative if you wanted to. I would say every 5 years, take another look. That's kind of the generic that's when the narrative, or that's when the trends come up to look at again, every 5 years after the, let's say 2020 was the WCM baseline year. Then yeah, you could, that's just a suggestion. I don't think, Kate, if you have any input, I don't think we have a hard and fast rule for narrative revision. It's sort of just, you write it to inform the 6 point and then the 8 point. But if you do find something wrong, or you want to edit it out, I think anyone could feel free to do that.
Yeah, I think Julie probably has the final say for Forest Service, but we've seen some folks revise it a little bit. I don't think we have seen much revision since people have just now started putting them together. But I don't see why they couldn't be revised in the future. Julie?
Yeah, sure. As new information becomes available, that's always an option. And I wouldn't see a problem with that.
Sounds good to me. I was thinking the same thing when the question came up. I know that we haven't passed the 5-year mark on a lot of these trends, so it really hasn't come up. So some of these things are new questions to all of us. So that was interesting. Then there's a lot more that looks like it's just kind of admin stuff, like where's the opinion and where's the tech guide and where's the BLM template. And it looks like we have all of that stuff covered in the chat. I don't know if we're going to get any more questions in the chat. If anyone has something for the group, maybe we could get a show of hands in the Zoom meeting if you have anything.
Well, feel free to reach out to the central team at any time. Maybe Drew or Jim, if you could post our PDL there, that might be helpful for folks. Or just reach out to me, and my email is in the chat. We're here to help you. So let us know what you need.
Hey, this is Patrick who asked that question earlier. Can I ask, kind of clarify the basis of my question? I was thinking more along the lines of the scoping process and thinking about things that could possibly be missed, and why, I don't know, it's like you got to put all that effort into scoping. You draft this narrative, you're using it then for all these planning purposes. And what if somebody along the line says, hey, you missed this very important value and somehow you guys didn't consider this in the narrative, and then
so Patrick, when you say scoping, I mean, my mind immediately goes to NEPA, and so is that kind of your reference here?
Yeah, a little bit. And just like think about the process Kate was describing of pulling together all the administrative documents, but then also talking to your local staff, kind of trying to get those local values, and then also kind of trying to incorporate the non-tangible things that are going to be harder to find, that might not be in your data and information that's going to pop up at the top of the surface, but
Sure.
require that more in-depth look.
So just really quickly, so these are not decision documents, and so they are not scoped, with the public. But you make a really good point of you need to involve your staff, your local experts and resources, and yeah, as things come to light that have been missed, that you should be able to revise those documents or make those additions or corrections, as you get down the road. So, I don't think we've seen a lot of that so far, but I think you certainly could.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, I would just throw in too, everything Julie just said, we kind of talked about, there's no problem with any of that, but I would try to make it transparent to everyone that worked on it or is involved that you made those changes, just so, not that it needs, I don't think for the narrative, we don't need to have it approved, like if you make that kind of change for the measure selection, you take out a whole measure or you make some huge change in the report, then you do want to have it all reviewed again. But for the narrative, if you're just adding in some more clarification that is an update,
Yeah.
I do still think it's important just for everyone to know. That's important enough. But I'll throw, because we do say a lot like, oh, send it back to the central team and everything like that. I think just probably letting other people know in the office that are associated that you made that change is helpful. But I don't. Yeah, as far as like official, you don't have to worry about. And you didn't ask about this, but I'll just say you don't need another official approval and review for that, unless you wanted the line officers to look at it. But yeah, I don't see any problem with doing that.
So anything else? We're a little bit past our time here. We really appreciate all of you joining us and excited about the work you're doing. And we're anxious to support you and give you what you need. So reach out to us at any time. So thanks, everyone.